Just a couple things on sovereignty. So yes, it's a huge factor in the way that the compacts were drafted. Look, it's absolutely unthinkable that those compacts would have been adopted were it not for the overt expressions of the primacy of state sovereignty. I don't believe many countries would have signed on to these things if they were binding. So right now we're in this situation around the world where states are increasingly reluctant to, as they say, pool sovereignty. And as a result, in fact, I do think that these global compacts were an astonishing achievement. The fact that they exist at all is an achievement. But they only exist, they were only signed by the countries that signed them, in my view, because they do respect state sovereignty, because they are legally non-binding. So what do we need to do to get beyond this? Well, we need to find ourselves in a situation where states are willing, once again, as they were after World War II and as they did, resulting from the Saigon evacuation and so on, where they're once again willing to pool sovereignty with other states in order to achieve common goals. I'll just leave it there.
Harald, I found myself at the beginning of your comments profoundly disagreeing with you, but then as I got to the end of your comments, I find that I fundamentally agree with you. I think you're absolutely right that the questions that we're talking about can't be looked at in isolation of the broader question of international cooperation and collective action. You know, when an airplane takes off from Nairobi and is going to land in New York, no one enacts sovereignty. It's in everyone's interest to make sure that airplanes can take off and land, that the internet works, that we share meteorological data. So there are moments every day where sovereignty is ceded in the interest of international cooperation, right? The trick is, as Howard said, it's how do we pitch the value of international cooperation as being in everybody's interest. So long as states in the global north know that they can enact sovereignty to pull up the drawbridges and sharpen the swords and contain refugees, buy off countries like Jordan, Turkey in particular, as long as the question of migration and refugees becomes part of this, bargaining. Kelly Greenberg's book, Weapons of Mass Migration, speaks to this, that so long as it's used as part of negotiations between sovereign states, as opposed to that moment at the end of World War II, where it's seen as a collective interest to find predictability and reliability, I think we're going to be limited. So I think you're absolutely right that we need to address this as a question not about migration, but about cooperation, that the state of the international refugee protection regime is indicative of the state of multilateralism and, as Howard says, the rules-based international order. And I think the question, Howard, that you raised was so fundamentally right. If we tried to negotiate the 1951 convention today, would we end up with the same document? Probably not. And why was it that in the lead up, in that, those of us who were involved, we all remember that time in October, November 2018, when the GCM and the GCR became the punching bag, became the object of populist, animus. I remember the parliamentary standing committee meetings that we had in Ottawa and trying to say, all of a sudden, we're talking about whether or not, international cooperation on refugee and migration issues threatens Canada's sovereignty. It became, it was a red herring. It became sort of the latest topic that these broader discussions about globalization and collective action came to the fore. And they long predate 2015. And this is the point that I want to make. And Harald, this is why you're so fundamentally right with what you encourage us to do. I was very involved in efforts to negotiate an executive committee conclusion on protracted refugee situations in 2009. And in 2009, states in the global south would not accept an executive committee conclusion, the most innocuous of international agreements. It's binding on nobody, but they would not accept a consensus document from the executive committee on protracted refugee situations unless it talked about the granting of citizenship being a sovereign right, that external actors cannot impose on any state whether or not they accept refugees as being citizens. So this is a deep and recurring issue, but the only point that I would make in contrast is it doesn't mean that sovereignty needs to be ceded in order to have governance in response to migration and refugees. And I know that's not what you're arguing, but instead, there needs to be that logic, there needs to be that reliability, there needs to be that buy-in that sovereign states are willing to commit themselves to cooperating to overcome collective action failure. And that's what we've seen, is this recurring collective action failure in responding to migration, responding to refugees. It's in everyone's interest to cooperate, but no one's willing to be the first one. So your comments are incredibly helpful, and I thank you for them.
Yes, thank you so much for the speakers. It was incredible. So I came from a different background. I came from a social work background, and my question might not fit here, but I'm curious to know your thoughts about this. In my research, I focus on fathering and fatherhood, and I was wondering, parenting, fatherhood issues in the context of the Global Compact and the context of like durable solution. Is there any mention about that? Is there anything that's written about that? And if not, why? Thank you.
Certainly around the Global Compact for Migration, in the end, there was roughly, I think it was 28 mentions around families and a real focus on children and on family reunification, or at least finding ways to bring and enable families to move together. So that was something that got addressed. But I think the other more nuanced things you've mentioned, less so. And then I'm gonna be a bit of a, whatever it is, I'm going to slightly disagree with Howard on the case of the Global Compact for Migration. And I think sometimes we group them together and it's great, but sometimes I think we really need to think about them differently, because the way in which the compacts emerged was totally different. So the Compact for Migration was a very participatory one. It's one that involved civil society, broad-based. It's one that emerged out of the Global Forum for Migration and Development for 10 years prior to getting there, about dialogues with the same people, the same organizations. It had all of the different international organizations. There was a whole lot more involvement also of cities, I might add, Harald, and also the mayor forums, and then also the CSOs and the private sector. So they've had different actors engaged in the process. And so I think the buy-in was different. I think the way it was structured in terms of who got to participate, who was involved in providing feedback, like I actually edited parts of it. And to have civil society, that would be the hat I was wearing during it, be able to weigh in on the actual document in some way is pretty big deal. Also, we got to weigh in on the floor. Like I spoke on the floor with member states, trying to push for certain changes. And so there was an opportunity for dialogue there that I think we cannot ignore. And I think that's why it's more relevant in everyday sort of geopolitics around migration at this point in time than maybe the refugee compact is. I also think that, listen, this is a commitment to multilateralism here. So this is actually, despite it being non-binding, we have 152 states that signed up, and then there's the ones that were on the fence, like Chile. They're still taking advantage of and participating in much of, but they're not really wanting to sign, because of their own sort of domestic internal politics. So I think while sovereignty was a factor, absolutely sovereignty was a factor. It's absolutely. And it's also the place that sovereignty is, it's one of the sites in which sovereignty is being articulated and national identity is being negotiated in respect to these types of issues. And so what's happening is when states come in, and like Canada, and they say gender equality, sexual and reproductive health rights, other countries get up in arms, but it causes there to be a dialogue about things that weren't on the agenda before around migration governance. And remember, migration governance is still very nascent when we think about it as a global, in a global governance framework, and certainly not as embedded structurally in the way because of the 1951 convention with respect to refugees. So I think when we're also coming back to the question posed by Harald, but then also the question overall, I mean, I think that the gains were a commitment to multilateralism. I think the gains were an agreement to work together despite or considering sovereignty. And I also think from a feminist perspective, we had gains in getting gender on the radar and it being like written into documents, and there being expectations that if states want access to the resources and the supports of the network on migration, then they have to at least do lip service towards gender. And so it's created this potential dialogue, and I think this opening for a discussion around ways to tackle issues around gender. I do still think, though, that gender inequality and discrimination are still both the key drivers of migration, but they're also still continued consequence of the way migration has been governed. And this isn't changing that, right? So my answer to the question we were posed at the outset is there's been some gains, absolutely. And I've mentioned some of those, but I think it's not going to do anything to help us realize SDG 5 at a global level. That's for sure, unless there isn't a more transformative approach where migration policy and governance is actually about realizing gender equality. So how you organize our express entry system in Canada could be rethought through for how it might have better outcomes in terms of gender equality. That's the kind of transformative thinking that I think states need to get to, but at least we now have a multilateral forum to continue to do so, and we have a set of playing rules by which to engage.
Thank you, Jenna. And Howard, I see your hand is up. There's also a question in the chat for Howard, which I would just like to pose now, and then maybe you can handle both at the same time. So the question is, how can preparedness to refugee crisis be implemented by potential host governments? In 3 steps, what are the actions that need to be undertaken?
In 3 steps.
3 steps.
Thank you for your question. But let me first just say one quick thing to Jenna. Jenna and I almost never disagree on things, which is good. But I wasn't saying much about the migration compact. Not to I wasn't involved in it to the same extent that you were, but I was involved in a number of these meetings. I could, if I chose, say abusive things about the migration compact as I did about the refugee compact. And one thing I would say, yes, you're right to point out some of the benefits that came out of the discussion and involving more actors. Yes, indeed. But quite frankly, I don't see that it made much advance over the Global Commission on International Migration 20 years ago. By and large, they could be substituted for one another, with some exceptions that you have pointed out, particularly on things like gender, the involvement of migrants themselves, etc. Okay, but we can talk about that another time. Fatin, wow, 3 things that need to be done. Okay, this is quick off the top of my head. First of all, we need leadership. I would say institutional leadership coming out of the international community. I'm not necessarily saying by international organizations like the UNHCR, but there was talk of a coordinating mechanism to deal with refugee emergencies. I think that's something that we need to see develop. So that's the first thing, institutional leadership that leads to cooperation amongst the states that are involved in an emergency. Secondly, of course, action that arises out of such leadership. Action that is quite specific, that countries actually agree taking upon themselves. And then the third thing, very quickly, is money. Let me just give you one example. I read this just yesterday, that the amount of support that has been generated for Venezuelan refugees is now approximately $600 per refugee. Not bad. But compare that to the amount of money that has been made available to the Syrians, $5,000. So in the case of the Venezuelans, not only have they mostly been ignored, except by some of the neighboring states, but the international community hasn't even been able to raise much money in support of Venezuelan refugees. So probably not a satisfactory answer, but right now it's the best I can do.
Thank you, Howard. So we also have a question from Adele for Jenna. And she asks, the GCM refers to women and girls as vulnerable migrants. What are your thoughts about this conceptualization? And actually, Jenna, there's also a follow-up question for you, which is, how did the GCR enhance the situation on refugees globally?
So I guess around the perception of women as vulnerable migrants, actually there was quite a debate about that, and also in various versions of the drafts of the compact, and UN Women, as well as the group that I was part of, the UN Working Group on Women's Human Rights in the Global Compact, wrote a number of things to try to push back on the use of that and to move away from that thinking. We got to vulnerable situations as being more commonly employed. So the idea that women and migrants face, enhanced risks of being in vulnerable situations, but it didn't get adopted at all points, right? So they at moments, I think, still are thinking, and it still is reinforcing this thinking of protecting women as compared to protecting their rights, and so I think that is still embedded and one of the problems and shortcomings of the GCM. But it certainly did move us ahead from where it would have been in what Howard was talking about. And I think that's where, sure, 10 years ago, we had some movement on coming to agreement about much of these things. But in terms of recognizing a more nuanced understanding about gender and gender equality, not so. And so I think that there's certain areas that have been really advanced in this time period. And I think that's one of them. The other is CSO involvement in the voices of migrants. There's some others as well, but I think that's some. And then in terms of the question on how the GCR advanced the situation on refugees globally, I don't know. I would defer partly to James on his view on that, but I would say that the two compacts working together is something that we need to see more of. And I think what I see anyway is that many of the same negotiators were involved. So governments were thinking about the Global Compact for migration, and then they had the Global Compact for refugees, and they were kind of juggling them. But in the fora in which they're being negotiated, it was separate. And so I think one of the hidden benefits that we don't see because they're hidden is that states were thinking about them both. And I think that is actually one of the potential benefits, because it moves us a little closer. This is some of the stuff that James has talked about before in some of his work, to thinking about the refugee system in a way that is connected to other types of movements and mobility. So I think that would be one point I would make. Also, the point I would make about the other point is that I think the GCR feels slightly shamed in not doing gender very well, because the GCM certainly did.
I think in answer to the question that Howard was posed about, what can be done better, and Jenna, to your point about, the opportunity for, I remember during the GCR consultations, everyone was talking about crosswalks. I thought we were in like the scaffolds of a theater. Everyone was talking like, what are the catwalks to get us across between the GCR? So there were opportunities that were missed. And I think to understand, why were they missed? Why were they siloed? A lot of it had to do with institutional competition between UNHCR and IOM, but that's the topic for a very different webinar. But I think fundamentally on the question about what do we take away from all of this, and on a note of optimism, what's the big lesson? And I think the big lesson is that politics matter. And that's not just because I'm a political scientist. Like what we find, and Jenna, as you were talking about the politics of language about LGBTQ plus within the GCM, within the GCR, within the refugee regime for years, countries like Egypt have said, we signed the 1951 convention, but these new guidelines from UNHCR on persecution on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation, we didn't sign up for that. So there's this notion that norms are created, that there's an effort for the international protection regime, its norms, its standards, its institutions to evolve. But there's a feeling that that's being done and being imposed on states. And Harald, it goes back to your point, that's when they push back. So, in answer to the question about, how do we prepare for refugee crisis? Forget 3 steps, I'll give you one. Imagine if we had an R20 squared. the 20 largest donor countries and the 20 largest refugee hosting countries, each and squared, because the representatives for those 20 countries, each with refugee representatives from within their territories. If those governments got together and started making deals on political facilitation that were rights-based, if it was taken out of the mechanics of multilateralism, where the GCR process was guided by a UN agency that has a non-political mandate, how on earth could it be expected to grapple with these core political issues? If we created a new space for political facilitation, could the outcomes be different? Would we respond differently if there was another 2015? I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know. But the status quo is untenable, so it's worth a try. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.